Along with being an artist, writer, entrepreneur, and filmmaker, Mike Richardson is president and founder of Dark Horse Comics. A Milwaukee native, Mike started his multifaceted enterprise, which now includes a retail chain, Things from Another World, in 1986, establishing its headquarters here in Milwaukee. But before that, in 1980, using a credit card with a $2,000 limit, Mike opened Pegasus Books, a comic book store in Bend. The business grew and expanded with new retail locations in Oregon and Washington. Frustrated with the lack of quality comics he was selling, Mike started Dark Horse Comics. Dark Horse had its own style, treating writers and artists as partners. The success approach is evident. Dark Horse Comics is the third largest comic publication company in the United States. Did I get all that straight?
Are there any questions?
Did you take that from George Harrison?
No.
Mike is also president of Dark Horse Entertainment and has produced many films and TV shows based on Dark Horse properties. Mike has written numerous graphic novels and comic series, including The Secret, Living with the Dead, and Cut. He's also co-authored 2 nonfiction books.
And the current book right now on the stands now.
Hellboy, The Sword of Storms, was nominated for an Emmy in 2007, and Governor Kitzhaber honored his work with a prestigious Governor's Gold Award in 2010. Mike enjoys reading Charles Dickens and James Ellroy. His favorite album is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He also likes basketball, go figure, big figure, guitars, and good wine. So join with me in welcoming Mike Richardson.
So I will explain where the Dark Horse came from. When we started Dark Horse, all of the comic book publishers were on the East Coast, the Northeast, primarily New York. So when we started Dark Horse, we were out here in the Northwest, and it was unheard of at the time. So we were a dark horse in that publishing industry. When we started in 1986, there was a boom in what was known as black and white comics, and within a year, about 250 or 300 companies went out of business, and we survived because we had a little different approach to our comics. But because it was such a long shot, we were a dark horse. But because I thought that I knew what I was doing, I still do every once in a while. Anyway, I'm right. Anyway, every once in a while. I designed the logo. The Dark Horse logo was a chess piece, which was my way of saying I really know what I'm doing, which I didn't have any idea what I was doing. But, you know, we treated people right, and we survived. I grew up here in Milwaukee. There's some friends that I see here that I grew up with, Mrs. Hill right here and Todd Hill, and back there Bob and Marianne Wisner. And the library, when I went to the library, it was in that brick building across the street from your library, the City Hall. And I spent a lot of time down there in that library. So library events, I always like to support them. And we actually brought some books that we're going to donate to the library after I show you those. But I will get into this this talk. If I'm not talking loud enough, let me know. Hi, Carrie. Also, Diana Schutz, our senior editor, who also edits Frank Miller, who of Sin City and 300 fame, is sitting right there. Diana, maybe you could wave. I told her she can't quit till I'm ready to let her go, so she's just stuck. She just keeps working and working. So anyway, so I always like to start this out and ask everyone, why do they call comic books comics? Does anybody know? Anybody have an idea? Anybody wonder? Because comics really aren't funny. Some of them are, I suppose, but most of them aren't. Anyone have an idea? Well, they're called comic books or funny books because the original comic books were reprints of comic strips. So they became the funny papers or the comic strips, they became comic books or funny books. And they were reprinted comics, or the comic strips. And why would they do that? It's because this is not known anymore. It's been forgotten. But there was a time where comic strip artists were some of the most famous people in the country. I think it's still near enough that we all know who Charles Schulz was with Peanuts and how famous and successful he was. In the 30s and 40s, there were 50 to 100 Charles Schulz. There were strips like Prince Valiant, Terry and the Pirates, Dick Tracy. They were so famous. Everybody read them every day. When there was a paper strike, the President of the United States would read the funnies because it was so traumatic to the population not to have those comics. So really, comic books are like the first video cassette because obviously the entertainment options were much less than they are today, and comic strips were so popular. In fact, if you look at old movies, and in some cities they still do it, on the newspapers, every city had competing newspapers. They might have been 3 or 4 in some cities. And they wrapped the Sunday paper in the comic strip, because if Little Orphan Annie was the #1 comic strip and you had it, you were going to make sure your newspaper beat the competition because of the comic strip. Not the headlines, not the writers, not the famous Pulitzer-winning writers, the comic strips. And so 2 guys got the idea, 2 salesmen got the idea, hey, let's repackage these. So we have this format where they took a newsprint, a sheet of newsprint, figured out how many times they could fold it, newsprint, the cheapest paper ever made on the planet, fold it a certain number of times, put the slick magazine paper that was in the newspaper on the outside so it'd have a cover so it'd stand up on the newsstand, where they were mostly sold in the Northeast at the time when they first started. And when it rained, they'd have something to protect the newsprint, which of course soaked up the water and ruined the comic. So they put 2 staples in it, and the reason they did that, because that was the technology of the day. That's how they made these. They made them to be as cheap as possible. They sold tons of them, and suddenly a new industry was born. Now, it wasn't born all the way, because comic strips mostly filled the comics of the day, but something changed your perception and everyone's perception of what a comic book was. It's 2 guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, created this failed comic strip that they tried for a number of years to sell, and someone bought it for a comic called Action Comics #1, featuring Superman. Like I say, a failed character in the newspaper strips. And that changed the comic industry. The reason we have superheroes today, the term didn't even exist back then, but that was because of Superman and that Action #1. Same company wanted something right away. Batman in Detective Comics followed very shortly afterwards, and pretty soon there were hundreds of imitations. Some of the big anthologies, which had been newspaper reprints, suddenly had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 superhero features or amazing hero features in them. So one of the sad things about that was that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were fired a couple years later after being paid about $350 and eventually banned from coming back to the company that they sold their character, unwillingly sold their character to. So this has something to do with the start of Dark Horse, but we'll get there in a minute. So just so you realize, some of you may not realize, how many read the Sunday Funnies? Everybody. Do people know Pearls? How many? Raise your hand. How many know Zits? Oh, this is a good crowd. How many know Mutts? Good? Okay. Okay, a lot of crowds you go to, very few people raise their hand. This is a very knowledgeable crowd, obviously. Anyway, but I'll ask you something else. How many people have ever heard of Flash Gordon? How many people have ever heard of Prince Valiant? How many people have heard Terry and the Pirates, Little Orphan Annie? But most of you haven't read one of those strips for however many years. Now you can get them in really nice books. They come out remastered and treated properly. But the point is that comic strips were so famous in those days that everybody knew the characters, and they've had a profound effect on our culture. To this day, you know who those characters are. You know about those characters, even if you haven't read about them. Big changes come in these comic strips, though, that you read nowadays. This right here. I'm going to show you what a comic strip in the 30s looked like. This is one page in the 30s. Now, let's look at this today. Very different. And by the way, Prince Valiant, by my personal favorite comic strip artist, Hal Foster, who was also a brilliant writer. His strip was done by a friend of mine today named Tom Yates, but that's what Prince Valiant looks like today. I could fold it some more. That's the difference. That's the respect these comics are given today. They don't have the same place in our culture because there's more competition. People have more things to do with their money. Video games, kids can play video games. The average reader of a comic book today is probably about 25 years of age, as opposed to in 1942, that age might have been 11 or 12. So you have a very different audience for these comics, and of course the comics have suffered as a result. Again, those comic books that you see, by the way, the comics are different too. So I'll just hold up this one again, 47 Ronin. Anyway, here's a comic from the 40s, Daredevil, which at one time sold millions of copies, and you can see that it's not even close to being the same. It's much shorter and narrower because this was done based on the sheet of paper. The way I told you, it was the technology of the day, and this is a really expensive attempt to force modern technology to mimic this. So, state of the art, really poor attempt. And this costs 10 cents. This costs $3.99. So, because it is so expensive. The newsprint that I talked about, this is not newsprint. This is slick paper. We can't even get that kind of newsprint anymore. So this is really expensive, this paper. So this package is expensive. So you talk about perceived value when you're reading a comic. One of the reasons the comic sales have fallen from those days is not only the competition, it's just the expense of the package. Because if you want 4 or 5 comics, you're going to put down a $20 bill. And also, the audience has aged. You know, what do you do with these when you're done? Well, what people do with them is they get comic boxes, and they put them in those comic boxes, and then those comic boxes go into closets. I know because I have about 170 of those boxes in a specially sealed room somewhere in my house where you can't find them, so don't look. Anyway, so they're very expensive. So the audience is older, and they'd rather have a book on a shelf, right? These are fine, but a 25-year-old, 35-year-old, 50-year-old guy who buys comics, man or woman, would like to have a book on a shelf. So this is what a comic book can look like these days. This is a Star Wars comic book. And we have fancy names these days because certain people are nervous about the term comic book. So we have terms like comics lit and sequential art. And there's a number of other terms. That way New York critics, high art critics can talk about them, and they don't have to talk about comic books. So comic books can look like this now, and they can cost a lot of money. I think this is $100 or $150, and you can sell tens of thousands of them. So it's very surprising. This book right here, just to show you, this book right here, Zelda, based on the video game, this book, and it has other things, but it also has, of course, comics. $35, it's the #1, not graphic or comic related book, it's the #1 book in the United States. Sold 400,000 copies so far. So when you think of comic books, we're not necessarily talking about these, although they'll call these different things. They're comic books. They're books with comics in them. We have a variety of formats. One thing we do is we archive those comics from the 40s and 50s in nice hardcovers. So remember, people like to put them on the shelf. So if you have a favorite comic strip, you can now get 6 issues or more in a nice book, put it on your shelf, pull it out. Don't have to go into that secret room at my house and dig out try and find it out of 170 books out there. This is another particularly good book. This is Crimson Empire, Star Wars book. I recommend it.
Written by Mike.
Archie from the old days, another archive. Everybody remember Archie?
Oh, yeah.
So comic books are different things than you might think right now. And they come in all different kinds of formats. In fact, Dark Horse, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, Diana can back me up, I think Dark Horse over our history, because one of the reasons for our success is every book we do, we have a meeting, we discuss the format, we like to have what we call good hand when you pick up the book for the kind of book that it is. We want it to feel good. So I would guess that we have published more formats. You're invited to come over to my office and look, but I would guess we've created more formats for the different books we do than any publisher ever. Every book is different, and it drives our print buyer crazy, but that's what we do. Most companies will have 3 or 4 formats, and everything gets shoved into one of those formats. Every book for us is a new experience. So getting back to Dark Horse, I wanted to talk a little bit about how by the way, if anyone has a burning question that they like, this is a nice cozy atmosphere, so I'm happy to answer any questions as we go. But I told you that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were fired off Superman, probably the most successful comic book character of all time, made, what, billions of dollars for there's a new Superman movie coming out this summer. They reinvent it, still putting out new Superman movies. Of course, there's another movie called R.I.P.D. that I invite you all to go, starring Jeff Bridges and Ryan Reynolds. Just happens to be a Dark Horse production, but invite you all to come to it. But Superman's coming out, made a lot of money. So when I started my retail store, by the way, the retail store, here's how you bought comics when I was in college. You waited till 12 o'clock. You told your wife you were running down to get some milk, okay? Then you drove to the 7-Eleven because they had a nice big glass window in there. You could see if anybody was in there. Then you could pull up real quick when no one was in there. You could run to the comic rack. You could grab them as fast as you can, get up to the counter, put them on the counter, pay for them, and get them in a brown paper bag before anybody got in there. That's how you bought them. So when I decided to start a retail store, and when that's another story too, because I always planned to start my own business, and I was trying to figure out what to do. By the way, Mary Ann Wisner is one of the people who suggested, why don't you start a comic book store right back there? And so I got this idea. My wife sent me this teddy bear with balloons and said, you're a father. And I took that and walked in my boss's, and I had a great job, but I walked in and said, I quit. And I told my wife, who had been the secretary to Bank Americard president at First Interstate Bank at the time, and told her to quit her job. And we were going to empty our savings, which consisted of about $500 and a credit card, and move to Bend, Oregon, where we didn't know anyone, with our newborn child, and start a comic book shop. You can imagine what my wife would say, but you'd be wrong. She said, great. It's a true story. We've been married for 40 years this year. Yeah, 40 years. I better know that number. Anyway, so we moved down to Bend, Oregon, and we started a little comic shop. Well, I started bringing in writers and illustrators into the store that did the comics, because the fans, it was only part of what we sold, but the fans liked to meet these people that did the comic books, and you take them out to dinner afterwards. But what you'd find out is none of these people owned the work that they created, which really, I'm an art major, that seemed really unfair to me. By the way, if you're going to start a comic company, being an art major is a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because you understand the artists and where they're coming from. It's a bad thing because I side with them against myself. So it's a mixed bag, I'll tell you. I'm on their side. Wait a minute, I have to be on my side. Anyway, so we started and we met all these people who didn't own their creations. So when I had first started the comic business, some of my friends, not Bob over there, but some of my friends had, they actually practiced an intervention. They came down to Bend, and the girls took my wife out, and the guys took me out, and they tried to force me to give up this crazy idea and move back to Portland, get my job back. And after several hours of arguing, I said, okay, I'll do it. Of course, they went home and I stayed there. I learned a valuable lesson there. Anyway, so I meet these writers and yes?
Why band?
Because I was doing a lot of stuff then, playing basketball, AAU basketball, and had a lot of friends. I wanted to focus all my time on what I was doing. So Bend was far enough away I'd be alone. And it was a good strategy because all my time went into this little business. And I can tell you, we meet people down there, and we started rock bottom. I grew up in Milwaukee. I grew up here. I bought the building that we're in over here, the old Milwaukee Pharmacy, is where I bought my comics when I first bought comics. There's a reason that I ended up in that building. I like to create irony, not wait for it to happen, you know. Anyway, so we went down there to be just basically so I could focus and get rid of all the other distractions, which if I would have stayed here would have been hard to do. We'd meet these writers and artists. So I got this idea that if somebody would start a publishing company, now I didn't know anything about retail. Like I said, I'm an art major, but there's a study that says that the least likely college discipline to be successful in business is what? No, business. It's true. Least likely, the largest percentage of people who fail at business are business majors. Not number, because there's a lot more of them, but the largest percentage. Second highest success rate are artists. Well, one of the reasons is, I'm sure passion plays into it, but the other reason is they say that business majors are taught to think a certain way, and that's how they try to apply it to their business, whereas art majors are free thinking and solve problems. Think around. I call it liquid goal setting. When you hit the rock, you don't stop, you flow around it. You figure out other ways to solve your problems. So anyway, so with this history in the background, I decided to start a publishing company where creators could own their work and be partners with the publisher instead of the publisher owning everything they do. Dark Horse was born for the name, for the reason that I said before, and moved back here. We had opened several other stores in the meantime. My brother Pat had come down to Bend, so he took over running that store. We opened one in Beaverton, one in Vancouver, we had up to 10 at one time, and then we created an online in the 90s, an online version. My stores were originally called Pegasus Books, and I was a victim of the state in that because I kept sending in names, and they kept rejecting them, and I was close to getting open. So I finally said, okay, I'll make a list of 20, and and this is absolutely true, I'll send that list of 20 to the state, and they can pick one. Just pick anyone off this. And I could only think of 19, and I was sitting there, 19, and I saw a little Pegasus statue, and I hated the name, but I just wanted 20 on there, and I put that, and of course, what happens? That's what they send me back, Pegasus Book. So we were Pegasus Fantasy Books, but I had to get rid of that name. I knew it right away because people kept calling and asking for adult titles because it's Pegasus Fantasy Books, something I hadn't foreseen. So a few years went by, and when we opened up for a while in the Milwaukee marketplace here, we made the change, and down at we also at the same time opened a store at Universal Studios, which is still there at City Walk. If you go to City Walk and see a spaceship crashed in the top of a store, that's my store down there. That's called Things from Another World. So I'm a fan of science fiction movies. The Thing from Another World, it seemed like an appropriate name. And then we opened a second store down at the other end of City Walk, which is no longer there. We've decided when you do half the business in each store to make the same amount of money, it seems like you get rid of the other store. But we named the other store after another science fiction film called Them. And we had a big giant picture on it. And then someone walked up to me and said, wow, you're a huge James Arness fan. And I said, well, I mean, I don't think I am. He said, well, those were his two pictures, The Thing from Another World and Them. So I have some subconscious James Arness. Anyway, so we moved to here. We pasted up the first comic. I put out a call. I was in something called App of Five, which for all young artists, I think it's still going, and writers, APA 5 and other APAs it stands for Amateur Press Alliance, and there's a number of them, and I joined that. And what you do is you write and illustrate, and there's a central mailer, and everybody does their pages every month, and you send them in the central mailer, and you send 50 copies, and there's a waiting list waiting to get in this. As people drop out, new people are brought in. Each one has their own rules, but APA 5 was the first comic APA. People like Frank Miller came out of it, and Randy Stradley and myself and a whole bunch of Mark Verheiden, who's currently doing Falling Skies right now. But what you do is you do your best artwork, and you do your best writing, and you send it in, and then everyone savages you and tells you how horrible it is and how awful you are. And so you build up a lot of thick skin. And it's a good thing, because if you're going to actually write and draw, when that goes out there, you better have thick skin, because people will say things that you may not agree with. So it's good to have that thick skin. Anyway, so when I decided to start the publishing, I had been doing that, so I got some of those people. Paul Chadwick was in it, who's won how many Eisners? Eisners are the Academy Awards of Comics, probably 6 or 7. Kurtzman Awards, which is like the Emmy. It's not quite the Academy Award. And a number of other awards. He's one of the most honored creators in comics. He does a strip called Concrete about a man who, through one night, finds himself in this 1-ton, basically, cement body. And after that, he's just a regular guy trying to live his life. And it's a very personal and human story, I guess I would say. So Paul was in that, Randy was in it, a number of the other creators we started with, but I did the first issue of Dark Horse Presents. And we were hoping, and another that was sort of an afterthought, there was a artist that lived in the back of his pickup. His name was Jim Smith, and told him we had this idea. I went down to the local comics distributor, because as we were pasting up comics on that, in that Beaverton store, there was this, what I talked about when we started Dark Horse, this black and white boom, which a year later was the black and white bust, when 250, 350 companies went out of business. But everybody was buying it at the time, and it was set off by a book called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which a couple guys made basically in their garage. And because of the direct sales market, which I'll explain, it was able to be very successful. When I grew up, comics were in the traditional distribution channels of distribution. You would print 100,000 copies, they'd be distributed everywhere, you'd sell 20,000, 80,000 come back. Very expensive way to do comics. By the way, when you see magazine racks and all those, go to Safeway, see all those, most of those books are all thrown out. We have books on the newsstand, and common sell-through is anywhere from 15 to 20%. So think of back in the 40s, where you had 1,000 titles printing in the hundreds of thousands to millions, and the vast majority thrown out every month. Think of all the magazines thrown out every month. Think of all the trees that have been cut down to paper wasted. That's that system. Well, a guy named Phil Suling out on the East Coast came up with an idea, because he wanted to buy comics cheaper, and it changed the whole industry. What he said, he went to the two top companies, Marvel and DC, and he said, look, I want to buy your comics non-returnable. Every comic you sell me, I will keep. I'm not returning anything, but I want a bigger discount from you. So they did it, he did it, and the direct sales market was born. So for a publisher like Dark Horse, we could have never survived. We could have never started without that direct sales market, because what it allowed us to do is get our orders first and then print to order. So we knew we didn't have to all that waste. We didn't have to hope that we'd break even. We could actually figure out where we were. Well, we hoped to sell 10,000 comics of Dark Horse Presents. And Jim, because all of this glut of comics was hitting the market, I had this idea, let's create a cozy little character and slaughter all those characters so there was more room on the comics rack for ours. So we created a comic called Boris the Bear. Our motto, a cute little bear with a Russian name, and our motto was, "We reserve the right to arm bears." And what Boris did was sort of clear off the rack so that his comic could be there without the other comic characters in there. And the stories actually took place out at our Beaverton store with my brother Pat behind the counter and Boris coming in and looking to see how things were going on the rack. But our first one was and you know, it's all done in fun, but the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were turned into soup and handed out free to the public. So that was the end of the Turtles. So we sold 80,000 copies. We had hoped to sell 10 to break even. We sold 50,000 of Dark Horse Presents, and then we decided, hey, this is a good idea. And so we continued to publish, and we started bringing in other artists under the same idea that you get to own your work and we'll be partners with you and we'll share in the profits. And at one time we were as much as 15% of the market, and we were the third largest. One of the things when you see market shares that come out from Diamond, which is the last existing comic distributor, is you'll see market shares there, but those are not an accurate reflection. Those are these pamphlet. Those are reports of the orders for these, and they don't include, for instance, that book, Zelda book, that I told you that we sold 400,000 of a $35 book, which is better than 30,000 of a $3.99 book. So it doesn't include any of that. So we also have a toy division, we have digital division, we have an online retail store that is becoming the Amazon of the comic hobby business. We have a film division, so all of those things aren't included in that, but we are the third largest comic company behind Marvel and DC. So any questions so far? Yes?
You talked a lot about print media. What about electronic?
We're going to get there. Okay. In fact, we can get there right now. You know, this is great. I told you how hard it is. There's all kinds of problems in comic distribution. First of all, shortages. Fan wants it, retailer doesn't know anything about it, he doesn't order enough or doesn't order any. We did a book with Andrew Vax and Jeff Darrow that showed up. It was an adult, it was about child abuse. It was written by Andrew Vax, who is an author, former assistant New York DA, who writes crime mystery novels and then uses the money to go after people involved in child abuse. That's been his focus for his whole professional career. So we did a book that was for adults, a children's book for adults called Another Chance to Get It Right. And he went on the Oprah show and he showed it for 8 seconds, our phone number for 8 seconds on the Oprah show, and we got 150,000 orders instantly, and it shut down our system. We had people answering the phone for, we answered, I think, putting 12 people at the phone for 24 hours, whatever it was. We answered about 4,000 of those 150,000. The reason we know 150,000, we asked the post office what was going on. So you have distribution issues, but nobody had the book. That's the other thing. At the stores, the retailers, we had only sold about 4,000 copies of the book. So all over the country, people were looking for this book, and it was not available because retailers didn't order it. There are missed shipments where the book goes to the wrong place or it ends up in a warehouse. There is damages to books. There's all of these things that happen. We get back a certain amount, could be up to 5% of everything we publish ends up damaged somehow, is reported damaged. So there's the tree problem that I told you about before, where all these trees are destroyed. Well, that is a product, if you remember, of the technology of its day. Those comics are the product of 30s state-of-the-art technology. This is not. This is using modern technology to mimic something that really isn't very effective. Now, this right here is state-of-the-art now. Almost same size. You can, oops, can't do it that way. Turn the pages, but you can make them big. You can make them small, not that small. Anyway, you can see how gorgeous these books are. They're beautiful. If you think about color, color is about light, and they can't look any better than this. This is light and color, and it's as good as a comic can look. And there's a lot of controversy with some people about this format. This format is the product of its day. It's a distribution system for content. This is a much more efficient distribution for content. Remember that 170 boxes of comics I talked about in my house? I could get 5 times that right here, carried around with me. So we've, in the comic industry, there's a company called Comixology that the other comic distributors have, or comic publishers have all used to distribute their digital. But wanting to have complete control over editorial and the look of our comics and actually have editors go in and look at the books and make them great, as Diana will tell you. You know, when we put Sin City up there, there's a lot of work that goes in to get it ready for being a digital comic. You put it to Comixology, they take it, scan it, throw it up. We didn't want that. Apple, when you put it on the iTunes store, they will edit your books for you of questionable material. We are anti-censorship. We aim our books at the appropriate audience. And we fight the idea that comics are for kids. Some comics are for kids, and it's very clear that way. In the 50s, a man named Frederick Wortham is a favorite one if you've ever heard that name, but he wrote something called Seduction of the Innocent, talking about how comic books were responsible for crime in America. I think there were some other factors like poverty and other issues, but that was his explanation for it. And of course later proven wrong, and even later he admitted he had been wrong. But because of that, if you ever remember reading a comic years ago, there was something called the Comics Code Authority. And that was a group of people who you didn't know who they were, looked over comics, made rules, and made sure that they thought your comic was acceptable. Dark Horse doesn't believe in that. We believe in making sure our content is clear, selling to the appropriate audience. One of the reasons for the packaging is to make sure that it's attractive to the right people. So the Comics Code Authority thankfully is gone, but it probably stifled advancement in that particular medium for 30, 40 years. And it's only recently, starting in the mid to late 80s, where comic creators could really have the control to write stories like any other person, any other writer or creator would write a story in any medium, film, prose, novelists. Now, these days, comic creators have that ability, and we have Pulitzer Prize winners now and award winners in the comic book industry as a result. But for 40 years, that wasn't true because of this Comics Code Authority. You could have never talked about the drug problem in America. You could have never talked politics. You could have never shown any kind of violence, any kind of crime, except really exaggerated cartoon crime with guys in tights. And, you know, guys running around in tights, I'm just saying, you know, there's sort of odd too, but we've accepted it over the years. Anyway, so yes, this solves that. So Dark Horse, unlike every other publisher in the industry, has its own digital program. And you can find us on all the different delivery systems, Nook and Android and Kindle. You find Dark Horse, and you can find it in the iTunes store. But you can also go to the Dark Horse digital site, where we have our own storefront, and we have the comics exactly as they should be seen, with care taken and putting them up. Not saying anything bad about Comixology. I'm just saying we know that we do it right, and we have the opportunity to make them the way we think they should be. So that's digital, and digital is now about 10% of our business. For those of you who are hanging on to paper, you're missing something, because especially iPad, it's amazing to read. My mom's 82 years old. She resisted. I bought her one. Now she carries around 10, 15 books wherever she goes. So she's 82, and Mrs. Hill knows my mom. And so So anyone here who is resistant, I think you should take another look because it's an amazing thing. And again, it's the technology of our time. I find it, Diana and I know are good friends with a famous writer, Harlan Ellison, who is responsible for modern science fiction. He did a book called Dangerous Visions that changed science fiction from being robots and ray blasters into being serious subjects and cultural reflections. But he refuses to give up his typewriter he bought in manual typewriter. This is the guy who invented modern science fiction, and he still will not give up that typewriter. In fact, when they went out of business making them, I think he bought about 6 of them, so they'd be there for the rest of his life. So I suggest to all of you who are resisting, grab these, particularly so that you can download some of our books, and it's great. For young artists and writers, when we were trying to get into comics, unless you start your own company, the great thing about starting your own company is my publisher publishes everything I want. And for some reason, he gets all the best artists to illustrate it and the best editors to edit. So you can do that. I don't advise everyone to try to do that. But now there are advantages we didn't have. When I was in college, if I would have wanted to go put my life into a career in comics, I'd have to move to New York. There's no other way to do it. Now, that's not true. First of all, you can submit your stuff by email. You can do it the old way, by registered mail. But you can do it. You have to understand that there's thousands of people doing the same thing. It's very hard to get noticed unless you're just amazed, especially if you're a writer. I don't have time to read the scripts I have to read, much less submissions. So you really have to have a great idea that can be told in a couple lines that we can see, wow, what a great idea. Most of the time when we then ask the amateur writer, we see that they're far from polished. So then there's a lot of work to go. So it's not impossible. But if you're a comics creator now, to get into the comics business, there's a great way to go, an opportunity that was never available to us, and that's the internet. Many of the creators today start their own websites, and they build their own fandom. Anyone here, it's easy enough to start your own website. It's not that expensive. And we go on the internet and look for these people. We've done Mega Tokyo, which was started by a guy named Fred Gallagher, huge following. We ended up doing the books afterwards, after we found him. Huge sales on those. Penny Arcade is another one. Perry Bible Fellowship. These are all big hit. Perry Bible Fellowship was #1 on the best New York Times bestseller list. These are guys that couldn't get arrested in the comic business, so they just bypassed it, started their own sites. They have talent. You can see them get better because they put out their pages every day. You look over a period of time. You just see them get better. I'm not sure if Carla, did she start on the internet? But she puts her comics up on the internet. And yeah, but she also puts them up on the net. But anyway, we look for those people, and that's a great way for people to start. If you want to go the old-fashioned way, for instance, Dark Horse, and every company has these guidelines. Each company has its own guidelines, but Dark Horse has its guidelines published. We look at everything. It's a lot of competition. I invite young people to come down to the office. They can make appointments. We do tours on certain days. You can call in and tell them Mike sent you. And anyway, you can come into my office, and what I do when people come in, I show them the artists we work with on the wall. And, you know, everybody who's an artist has, like myself, you draw when you're a kid. Everybody says, oh, how good you are, and you do all that stuff. But you have to have a reality check, because this is who you're competing against for these jobs. Those people on the wall, for all of you that want to be artists, those people on the wall have one thing you don't have. That's years of practice. That's all it is. They practice and they practice and they practice. They carry their tablets around. It's like the basketball players you see that always have the basketball. They've always got their books around. The first thing I tell people is don't try to draw comic books. Don't copy out of comic books. Sit out in a park bench and draw what you see around you, because it's great to draw the figures, but if you can't draw the panels and if you can't tell the stories, then you're not going to have great success. You have to actually learn how to draw. And doesn't mean you have to be an expert draftsman. You get people like Frank, who's probably not, Frank Miller, is probably not considered a draftsman, but he's an amazing comic artist because he knows enough how to design characters, how to design panels, how to have panel storytelling. So my test for whether an artist is a great storyteller or a great artist in comics is if you close the book and you don't remember panels, if it's like a movie in your head, you've just read an amazing comic because you flowed right through. A great artist in comics, you will stop and study every panel, and you know some of the artists I'm talking about, but you have no sense of story because you spend so much time looking at the art. So doesn't mean you can't be that kind of an artist. There's very successful artists like that. But if you want to be a true comic artist, it's to learn how to tell the story, how to use sequential art in your storytelling. And you can only do that by studying what's actually out there so that you can convincingly, even if you're doing like Frank, he can convince you that even though this really doesn't look like a van, you don't even think about it. It's a van. And so drawing, that's the thing. That's the one thing I tell every aspiring artist that they have to have is the practice, and practice, 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 and not just looking at comic books. Many kids try and draw panels like their favorite comic book artists, like I did. And it's not the way to do it. I see we're moving along. Any questions? Yes.
Any Dark Horse Film Studio in the works?
Yes, well, let me talk a little bit about Dark Horse Entertainment. So when I started the retail store and the intervention, I told you about that. And then I told everybody I'm starting a publishing company, and of course that went over big. Oh, how could you sacrifice your other business? Well, that went over good. And then I told them I was going to go get into the film business. And Bob used to roll his eyes too when I used to say that. Anyway. But it's interesting because I had a couple stories that I hauled around with me. One was called The Mask, that we ended up doing with Jim Carrey, which, by the way, was in that Appa 5. That's where that idea came from. I used to draw that character in Appa 5. And the other one is a story called Time Cop. And I met a producer by the name of Larry Gordon, who's one of the legendary Hollywood producers. He did Field of Dreams and Die Hard and 50 other famous movies, really successful movies, I should say. And Larry would call me up one day because I tramped around Los Angeles for about 5 years, and people say, remember, I promised all our creators that I would take care of them, because comic creators in the film business got taken horrible advantage of. They take their creations, pay them a few bucks, and they were gone. So I told all the creators, I'm not going to let anybody, I'm going to take care of you. So when people started calling us, we started getting critical success. People started calling us, wanting to license our books. And so I said, well, I have to produce, because that's the only way I would have a chance of protecting our creators and my own interests, quite frankly. And of course, they'd say, well, what experience do you have producing? Well, it didn't matter to me. I didn't have any experience retailing or publishing either, and I was doing pretty good. So we started Dark Horse Entertainment. We produced a movie right here in town, a little horror movie called Dr. Giggles with Larry Drake from LA Law. We shot it in Omark Park, one of the Omark buildings right up the street, and at Eastmoreland and at Oaks Park, and those three locations. And a fake backdrop, which if you watch the movie, it was my first experience with forced perspective, because you will think that actually exists. It's just a painting that they're standing in front of, but you lose your perspective. And I thought, wow. You know, because when I'm watching it live, I'm saying, wow, this is the hokiest thing I ever saw. But then you see it, and wow, it worked. Anyway, so we did a little movie, Dr. Giggles, and then we did the two movies that really put me in the film business. The Mask was knocked out of first place by Time Cop, and I had the #1 and 2 movies in the country, so then, of course, you get for 5 minutes, you're a genius down in Los Angeles. My next movie was Barbed Wire, and then I was no longer a genius. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. Anyway, so yes, we've produced over 27 projects now. We have, I think it's our 28th film project coming out this summer. It's R.I.P.D. with Jeff Bridges and Ryan Reynolds. And you can see some of our stuff still playing on television. Most of the movies, Hellboy movies, are ours. Alien vs. Predator. I wrote the original treatment for it. What else? 30 Days of Night. There's a lot of stuff. And the one I'm most proud of, John Landis is a friend of mine. He's director of Animal House and Blues Brothers and Trading Places. And he was going out to dinner with Don Rickles one night. He was supposed to go out to dinner with me, but he tried to dump me to go out with Don Rickles. Go figure. And I said, I will never speak to you if I don't go to that dinner with you. So I went to dinner with him and Don. And Don, we had just gotten a fund from a small company to do independent movies. And we had shot about 4 of them up to My Name is Bruce with Bruce Campbell. Are any Bruce Campbell fans here? Yeah. So we shot a Bruce Campbell movie here in Oregon, which was a lot of fun. And we're going to do another one, too, so it's coming up. It's called Bruce Campbell versus Frankenstein. It's really high art, so anyway, but it's a lot of fun if you know who Bruce Campbell is. Anyway, so Don told me that he'd had a great life, but he wished somebody would do a documentary on him someday. And I just got this money, right? Don, how much can a documentary cost? Right? So, Don, I'll do it. We're going to do it. Mike, you wouldn't lie to me, would you? And he puts his hand on me. Look me in the eyes. This is our bond. I'm a sucker for that stuff, so I'm stuck. I knew I was just put my hand into the tar baby, and I'm not getting it out. Anyway, so I said, yes, we're doing it. So John ended up directing it. We ended up doing it and made not a penny. It cost $500,000, really low budget. It's played endlessly, sold a ton of DVDs, played online, and the company that distributed it tells us we're about $3 million in the hole. We can't figure out that's quantum physics. That's something we won an Emmy for it, and it's called Mr. Warmth, the Don Rickles Project, and it plays on HBO all the time, and I'm as proud of that as anything we've done. It's an amazing peek at Don Rickles, who is probably the most loving human being you would ever meet. He's a great guy. His onstage persona is not who he is. That's his shtick from the old days. My favorite Don Rickles story, I'll tell my favorite Don Rickles story. Don was getting nowhere in his career early. He was in New York. The nightclubs were all owned by the mob back then. Not the art mob, but the old one. And Frank Sinatra's mom knew Don Rickles' mom. So Mrs. Rickles called, why don't you have your boy Frankie help out my boy? Your boy's so famous, he's making all this money, help out my boy. And Mrs. Sinatra said, done. So she calls up Frank and says, I want you to go to this place. Little Don Rickles is over there. You need to go there and help him out. So Frank said, okay, Mom, I'll go there. So she calls back Don's mom. Don's mom calls him and he says, thanks, Mom. So Don puts a table up front. He puts a statuesque blonde sitting at it. He does his show. Frank Sinatra comes in with all his, as Frank says, all his friends. And they all sit down at a table, and Don gets done. He sits down and starts eating dinner with his date. And all of a sudden Frank says, well, I got to go over there and do my thing for my mom. I think Don knows I'm coming. So Frank walks over and says, hey, Don, how come you never call me? And Don throws his fork down and says, Frank, I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, don't bug me when I'm eating. And Frank Sinatra loved him from that day on. More questions on comics? Yes. Or anything.
I just wondered if you'd touch briefly on another passion, on basketball, and related, if it connects at all. I'm interested in the professional culture that you've built over here.
Oh, well, two good questions, because when I started Dark Horse, Portland there was no comic culture. You moved to New York if you want to be it. We started moving people. I started moving people. Those people started moving people. Some of my people went and started comic companies. They started comic companies. A good portion of the people who have started comic companies of any size used to work for me. And now Portland is literally the comic book center of the United States. Maybe the mayor of Portland has declared it Comic Book City. There's big events, particularly around a local convention that's not the flea market conventions. It's a creator-friendly convention called Stumptown. So I advise any young creators to go and see that. You'll be able to talk to lots of creators. That's what it's about.
April 27th and 28th.
Coming up.
Oregon Convention Center.
That's right, coming up very shortly. So I definitely advise young artists and writers to go and talk to some other people. These are indie comics people, there are Marvel and DC people, but these are people who are creating their own comics. A lot of them are self-publishing them. It's a great experience for young people trying to break into comics. Now I'll get to one of my more favorite subjects, basketball. Yes, I still play basketball. We won the Pan Am Games 2 years ago. Brazil was favored, and we were up by them by some 41 points. And I will say the first 2 plays of the game, I blocked a 7'2" center shot twice. And it wasn't just a block, it was a cap. So I just have to say that. So they stopped trying to go into them. But we took 3rd in the World Games in Australia 3 years ago. And 2 years ago, they won the Pan Am Games. And this August, we're going to Turin, Italy to play in the European World Games. Why would you ask me that question? By the way, thanks. I like talking about myself in basketball.
I'm an old Mustang basketball player myself, but I also, team sport's been an influence in the way I approach my work, and I was just curious if that's carried over at all.
I agree. I've played sports all my life. I know they just fired the coach of Butler for being too aggressive with their players. Rutgers, was that it? Oh, yeah, that's right. I can just say Louis Cheragino coached us, and I loved him to death. I mean, the coaches were tough, and you took it and you didn't care. You knew what was expected. So all of this, you have to be nice to the players. That's a different coaching philosophy. I think that you demand. Yes.
Hi, I'm hoping to go into the comic book profession. I want to know what would be some good advice to making them more popular.
So if you, after this we're done here, I'll sit and tell you, okay? So anyway, yes, I think that college sports are sports all our lives. I mean, we grew up playing sports all day, every day. Bob over there will tell you that's just what we did. And I never stopped, and Bob did.
Only after I tore my knee.
That's true. Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you, Mike. What was the first favorite comic book you bought?
I can tell you, I know as plain as day because I was with my grandmother, and we were in a store, and I didn't know this at the time, but my mom was a big comic book fan. I could read going in the first grade because I had to know what was in comic books. So my mom used to sit on the couch knitting, and I'd say, "What's this word?" And she'd say, "The." "What's this word?" "Man." "What's this?" And she'd knit while she'd do it. And so I had to know what was in those comic books. She used to bring them home even when she had kids. And so I read those things, and I loved them. And I remember the first day of school, they passed out Fun with Dick and Jane, and I read it while they were passing out. There was like 3 words. So somebody said, "Were you ever bored with school?" And I said, "Yeah, I think on the first day." So anyway. The comic, so I'm in a store with my grandmother, and there is a 25-cent comic called Secret Origins. And it had the origin of a whole bunch of characters, and I hadn't even seen some of them before, and that was so exciting. But my grandmother bought it after much pleading. 25 cents was a lot of money in those days. People don't understand. So she took it home, but she would only let me read one story in it each day, which probably in retrospect made it that much better because I was so eager to do it. You know, when my kids were growing up, my girls, if you've ever been in my office at home, I have toys and all kinds of stuff around, creative environment. And they wanted to play with those, so I bought 2 little boxes of toys that they could only play with when I was working. So when they'd come into the room, they'd always ask for those 2 forbidden boxes of toys, and they left everything else alone. So they still talk about that. So we always want the stuff we can't have, right?
How do you feel about the Big Bang Theory and how they treat comic book people and comic book stories? Have you ever seen Big Bang?
Yeah, of course. We work with Felicia Day, and we do the Guild, which she does, and the star of that show is also part of her network, as are we. We do motion comics on that, her site. But I think it all comes from a place of truth, so there's generational differences, that's, Big Bang Theory is not our life at that age, but it's, I think there's, yeah. Yes.
Is there a difference between comics and graphic novels?
Yes. Graphic novels, the word graphic novels has more letters in it. They're all comic books. We've come up with ways to not say the word comic book, and if you put a square spine on it, you don't have to call it a comic book anymore. That's I don't like the terms like comic lit and stuff. I've editorialized on it. Comic books are comic books, and the thing is, average reader of a comic book now, 25 to 35. It's not 10-year-old material. And by the way, you wouldn't show a lot of comic book material to a 10-year-old. It's not intended for them. I did an interview, I believe it was with CNN, down at my store. We have a store in Los Angeles. I think I told you it's on the Universal Studios. If you see the spaceship, stop. But anyway, they did an interview, and we thought it was about the store, and then she pulls out an Aliens comic and said, how would you let your kids read this comic you publish? And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you publish this, don't you? And I said, yeah, are you crazy? It's Aliens. I wouldn't let my kids read this. They were like 6 and 8 at the time. So, parents have a big responsibility in deciding what their kids, in our house they did. My kids didn't get to watch MTV. I'm in the film business. I don't want them watching it. That's my rule. Did they watch it when they went other places? Probably, but they knew what my rule was, and they respected it when I was around. But that's okay, as long as, see, for me, it's not the watching. It's for them to know some of the stuff on it was not appropriate. So just knowing that I didn't approve it, when they watch it, they're seeing it through their filter. Yes?
What do you consider your greatest success?
I think my greatest success is just having a company where people can come and enjoy, and I like working with the people that we have. Maybe I sort of like working with Diana, but she's my editor, so I have to take a lot of guff from her.
I'm wondering on the stories versus art, when you're creating or reading somebody else's work, what comes first to you?
Well, being an artist, I'm always very interested in how the art looks, but I have to say I've been surprised, and I think that, or an art major I should say, I've been surprised because my own definitions of what makes a good comic has expanded. I will tell you that one of our big successes right now is a comic by Matt Kent, in which probably the most uncommercial art style there is out there. Storyline unique, but gripping, and it's become one of our surprise successes. Not only that, Hollywood is the least likely place to appreciate anything out of a very narrow definition, and they even went crazy for this. Almost immediately, we had like 5 studios trying to partner with us to make films on it. So we did end up with, we partnered with Ridley Scott, but if you ever saw it, you would never expect for them to ever be interested in this, just because it's so personal and so very outside the normal comic book range art-wise. So, the bottom line is, I like a comic where the story and art work together to grab you, just like anything else you watch or read or entertain yourself with. Yes.
Going back to some of the history, when did all the licensing with Fox come into play?
Well, comic books licensing, we are the pioneer in that. While comic book licensing had happened before, they usually got any artist that was available, slapped the logo on the outside, usually pretty crummy books, not very much thought went into them, and they'd count on the logo to sell the book. So if you had Star Wars, you put Star Wars on it, get whoever you could to do it, not pay much attention to the story or the continuity from issue to issue. We had a very different approach. We decided to go after the movies that we really liked and then do the sequels to the movies. So we'd walk down to Libby's down the street, and we'd sit in there and talk over a story probably for 4 or 5 hours, and then we'd come up with a sequel to, and because we were fans, I hate to use the word fanboys, but that's probably more accurate, but because we were fanboys, we'd go down there and wow, this would be the greatest sequel ever. We did it with Star Wars. Our first Star Wars book was right after the last movie. Luke gets taken over by the dark side and starts operating as Vader's, under the power of the Emperor, taking Vader's place. Huge seller. I mean, we're still selling. It's called Dark Empire. Aliens, we brought Ripley back and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Predator, we did a sequel to Predator. We went and saw the movie because the same licensors at Fox, and we talked to them about we ran at lunchtime, went and watched this movie because it was at Fox, the same people who licensed us Aliens. And so we did Predators in the Jungle, Predators in the Steel Jungle. That's simple. By the way, that movie in comic book history, we did the comic that they based the movie on, and then we had to license the movie to keep it and do the comic. So we have the only comic based on a movie based on our comic in history. So that's the crazy places licensing taking you. And then we did the blockbuster license book of all time, which was Aliens versus Predator. And we just put the two together. We put chocolate in the peanut butter, you know. Yes?
How did you feel that they did a portrayal of, what was your opinion of the portrayal of The Mask? Jim Carrey playing as the character and, of course,
Well, I was really happy, overjoyed, and this is why. He asked, how did I feel about the Mask movie and Jim Carrey's portrayal? When we sold The Mask, the comic book was more violent than the movie was, and John Arcudi, who was the writer, I was editing it, and it's my own character, so I was trying to hold him back, but John has a fun streak in him, and so we were trying to control it. So when we did the movie, I got to write the treatment my way. Well, my version, you put the mask on. He's a Tex Avery character. If you don't know who Tex Avery is, most famous animated, created Bugs Bunny and created Droopy and all kinds of my favorite animated characters. My favorite animated characters are all the anarchists. If the original Bugs Bunny was an anarchist, you put a gun in his face, he doesn't care, he puts his fingers in it. Mickey Mouse was an anarchist when he started. Woody Woodpecker was an anarchist when he started. So they didn't even obey the laws of nature, if you watch this. But as time goes, when corporations get involved, they make them all cute. So you lose, they become not interesting. What people don't understand is those original animated shorts, 7 minutes, were made for adults. They weren't made for kids. It's only when television came along that they suddenly became for kids. So now you have CBS, who takes all the round bombs out and shotguns out and all of that stuff, because kids will go shoot and throw round bombs, although all the people that make those decisions watch those same cartoons and they're not throwing round bombs and shooting shotguns.
So is Jim Carrey enjoying that?
So thanks for putting me on. That's back on track. So Jim, the first treatment that came in, they turned it into a movie where this is true, a mask maker on the edge of town was cutting the faces off corpses and putting them on teenagers to take control of them. So, no, I wasn't happy. And so we fought. It took 5 years of fighting, and we fought. And then they wanted to put Rick Moranis in the lead role. No offense against Rick, but that's not what I saw. And then they did a version. They did about 3 versions. They had Chuck Russell, who ended up directing it, had done Nightmare on Elm Street. And he was sort of trying to push it for that direction. I was trying to push the Tex Avery. I don't think that he even knew who Tex Avery was at the time. But there's an amazing document that got sent to me where our director said, hey, I just had a great idea after 5 years. Let's do it as Tex Avery type thing. And I said, hey, that's a great idea. And we still arguing. Then they want to put Martin Short as the mask, and that's not right. And then Michael DeLuca at New Line sent me a tape, and he said, you know who the white guy in Living Color is? And I said, yeah, I think so. Fire Marshal Bill? And he said, yeah. So he sent a skit. I think you see it online. It's the funniest thing I ever saw. It's My Left Foot, the film with Jim Carrey in a wheelbarrow, drinking, pouring, taking the stein off the counter and pouring beer in his mouth with his foot. He actually does it. And then get in a fight where he puts brass knuckles on his toes and jab, jab, right cross with his left foot, or left cross. Anyway, so I called him and said, that's the thing. And when we first met Jim, I asked him what he had been doing. And he'd been around for a long time. That's what people don't realize. He was living in his car at one point. And Jim said, I just did some horrible movie about a dog detective that's going to be out of the theaters in a week. And that was Ace Ventura. So Ace Ventura came out and everybody noticed him, but then The Mask came out. Now The Mask did $360 million worldwide when you paid $4 to get in. So today that's $1 billion movie by today's standards. So you can see how successful it was. So then that put me in the film business, basically, instead of pushing all the time. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say, you try to do comics with local projects like Grimm and stuff like that, and the other question was if you did any tours at Dark Horse at all to the public.
Yeah, you can call and get a tour. We used to do them daily. We're talking about maybe increasing them at some point, but at one time we had people tromping 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and so we just cut them back because it's too disruptive. So we have some ideas about how maybe to set up a place for people to come and see how comics are made at some point.
Do you do any projects with like local, like Grimm and stuff like that?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, location doesn't mean anything. I mean, I think we might be doing something with Grimm, but we're not doing the comics, so we may be doing some product with them, I think. But, you know, as I said before, we changed the whole licensing industry. They all come to us first. We take good care of their properties, Star Wars being the gem. And, you know, we just announced that George Lucas wrote a very different script called The Star Wars before it got rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And we just announced last weekend that George is going to let us do The Star Wars. Luke Skywalker is very different. He's much older. Darth Vader looks very different. It's a very different story. But this was the Star Wars, the original Star Wars story that George is letting us do. So for him to do that, you have to understand that creators, producers, directors want to work with us. We work with Guillermo del Toro, who I've done 2 films with. Actually, counting animated films, we've done 4 films together. And he's writing a book called The Strain for us. We've worked with Sam Raimi. We work with Joss Whedon, who actually does, since they canceled Buffy the Vampire Slayer, he does season 8 and season 9 in graphic novel form. There, I used that word, in comic book form only. And so you can if you're a Buffy fan, you can get the seasons written by Josh, the outline by Josh.
You know, in terms of local stuff, you might want to mention City of Roses.
City of Roses. If anybody here of Phil Sanford, he was the reporter for years for the Oregonian. Dark Horse now opens through astute positioning and paying attention, owns the trademark for Crime Does Not Pay, if you've ever heard of that before. So we are releasing a number of true crime stories under that title. And right now, Phil Sanford's writing about the Portland scene of the 70s. And it's a lot of stuff that probably some people aren't happy that he's writing this, but pretty interesting. So it's coming out right now, yes. Yes.
How does one go about submitting their work to your company for consideration?
We have if you go online, darkhorse.com, we have a submissions guideline. And you can go there, it tells you exactly how to do it, and every submission is seen. So, but you have to remember, thousands of them come in, but if you're a published author, and we know that, you should put that because you might get extra consideration. So, yes?
Have you considered broadening Dark Horse's horizons to interactive media?
Sure. We actually started a game company at one time, and a company called EA. Every time we trained somebody, they took them away by paying them about twice the amount that we could afford. So now we have partnerships with companies like EA, and very successful. By the way, Zelda book that I told you is a partnership with Nintendo, and we do a lot of packing of creating product and comics to go inside the games. So right now that's a matter of financing, and we're busy building our digital empire right now, which is very expensive. Questions? I've answered. Oh. Okay.
I was going to ask, what would, if you could go back, what would be the advice you'd give your high school, graduating high school self? Or what type of advice would you have?
Well, I love the Nike saying, just do it, because I talk to so many artists and writers who are going to write someday, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and, I was always somebody who just did it, but even myself, I waited. I could have done the same thing 10 years earlier if I had really have thought about it. I started my business on, January 1st. I opened my first business January 1st, 1980. And I wish I would have done it January 1st, 1970. It would have been great. So I would just say, decide what you're going to do. The amazing thing in this country is you're going to eat and you're going to have a roof over your head, and one way or another you're going to get by. So, I've risked everything many, many times, and you're still here, So I just tell people to really decide what you're going to do at an age and go for it, because especially the kids I talk to, they think people who make movies or write comics or do these different things, somehow they're born into that spot. And it's not true. It's just for the people who go do it. I grew up the street. I didn't know anybody in L.A. and didn't know it. I knew Mrs. Hill across the street. But you have to go do it. And the people who are doing those jobs, Mark Verheiden's another one here from Portland area. He went down to L.A. about the same time I did. He's had an amazing run. Did Smallville and Battlestar Galactica. He's doing Fallen Skies right now. And just a local guy, no special inroads. You just go and you work, and if you work hard enough and practice enough and are persistent enough, somebody's got to do it. Might as well be you. Yes?
It's great that Zelda book did so well, but was it true there were some stumps? I heard there was actually a fire.
Fire?
Yeah. Was that just...
I think I'd know about it. No fire.
Oh, wow.
What fire? What kind of fire?
There was a lot of...
I'm interested in rumors too.
Yeah, there was a lot of rumors. I work at a video game store, of course, because of Nintendo. So there was a lot of people giving me these rumors that there were short press because there was some kind of fire in the warehouse.
There's 340,000 copies out there right now, with another 60,000 on the way from China. So the reason there were shortages is because a book like this will normally sell maybe 10,000 out the gate. Well, this sold like 120 out the gate. So as soon as we see the orders, we're rushing printing. Then you've got to find paper. So you're chasing around trying to find enough paper, and then you get the 120 out, and then you get orders. Amazon ordered 6,000 a week till June. So we got to figure out how are we supposed to do that. So it's hard, but especially. Pardon?
That fire sounds like a really...
Yeah, a good excuse, I guess. But anyway, no fire. It's just the sheer volume of orders. Yes.
So I know, occupy quite a bit of space in downtown Milwaukee and a real presence. Do you feel like you might outgrow Milwaukee?
I don't want to. I'm not that happy with how the state is treating businesses, but I won't go there. But yeah, I want to stay in Milwaukee. That's where I grew up. I tried to live here, but we couldn't find anything at the time. Yeah. No. It's not an accident. The first building that we owned was where I bought my comics. Like I said, I like to create my own irony. Yes?
Do you find that the compilation volumes sell better and make more money than the individual?
It's a good question. What she's talking about is, do the books that I show you, when we do 4 or 6 issues, that's usually one story cycle, and then we well, this one right here. This is actually 3 different series. There's Crimson Empire series 1, 2, and 3. And then we put them in books. So if somebody wants the whole story can buy the book. Because the audience has grown older, these are becoming less popular. Some people hang on to them for nostalgia's sake. But think about a story. Think about buying a novel. And think if you can get 20 pages of that novel every 30 days for 2 years. It's not a very good way to read a story, and that's what these do. And so comic people are trained to wait, but I don't think anybody likes it. And I think as time goes by, especially Dark Horse, because from day one we started making these, not this nice in those days. I shudder at some of the early ones, printed out in Forest Grove for early days. But I'd rather sit down and read this like you would any other book, have your whole book. So because our audience is getting older, the comics audience is older, and quite frankly, the kids are much more sophisticated these days. They like to sit down and read a book. Yes?
I've always been a great Tarzan fan. Are you considering anything with...
Well, it just so happens we're working on a Tarzan film at Warner Brothers that we're hoping to get greenlit in the next couple of weeks. That we've been working on for 10 years now. Danton Burroughs, who was Edgar Rice Burroughs' grandson, was a very good friend of mine, and passed away. They had a house on the old ranch, what's left of the old ranch. Tarzana was their ranch. And they had all Edgar Rice Burroughs' precious collectibles in there, and a fire started in there when he was showing someone, and he had a heart attack and passed away that night. Yeah. So for me, it's sort of a mission to get that movie made in the way he always wanted to see. Tarzan was a very educated person. He didn't say me Tarzan, you Jane. He went to college and spoke 2 languages, so very different than the movie Tarzan that you normally see. So
how he's treated in the new movie.
Yeah, it's like the books. He leaves from London, where when they first in the books, he's taken to London right away. He's Lord Greystoke, and has a vast holdings there. Any more questions?
Do you write as well as draw?
Yes, I'm glad to sell you all of my books. I've got a lot of them. I don't draw anymore. Very little, as there's no time.
You do it every day, and how you separate the business aspect from the creative
Well,
side, stay focused on.
I have a different look at life. I feel sorry for people, just my viewpoint, who go to a job 8 to 5 and watching a clock, and then they live their life. My life is, I like everything I do. I've been lucky enough to create. I like going to work. And I go home and I'll write, or I'll go home and come up with something that we have to do, or Diana's yelling at me to get my script in. So it's just my life. Yeah, I don't divide it up like other. I have my kids, and they're all part of my life. My daughter Melissa, who was born the year that I started Dark Horse, is working at Dark Horse. I'm pointing there. My daughter Molly, who was born the year I started Dark Horse Entertainment, is in New York trying to get on Broadway. And my daughter Michelle is still living at home. So it's just all part of life, And I don't, there's something that's not used the same way he used it, but there's a book called Thriving on Chaos, and that's me. Because I overload people, because I got a lot of things going on in my head.
Mike, have you noticed there's a lot of movies now announced that are remake of characters that we grew up with?
Yeah, the sad thing about the film business is that we won't see Lawrence of Arabia or All About Eve ever again. It's good for my business, Dark Horse Entertainment, because this is what we do, but if you walk through a theater, look what's playing. Video game movie, superhero movie, comic book movie, horror movie. You know, it's the culture's changed. Part of it's changed because of more disposable income, more leisure time. I mean, I can't even imagine my dad sitting around playing video games, but these days a lot of 50, 60-year-old guys play video games. I know them. They're artists and writers that we're trying to get to work on their books. But I can't, it's true. I could name one right now, but I won't. Anyway, there's more leisure time, the culture's different, it's just a different thing. Yes?
Having an art education, what's your stance on art education? I've heard from a lot of people that we can go either which way in terms of receiving a degree and not receiving a degree in art, but...
My opinion is a degree is an amazingly helpful item to have. My first job out of college, because I became a designer there, but because I had a college degree, somehow they thought I was smarter than the other 300 people in the plant. So I ended up with my own building. I was the only one in it. And sort of setting my own hours and because I had a college degree. So I don't know if that's still true, but I think it's an amazing resource to be able to say that you have a college degree. I think it gives you time, college gives you time to think things out too, because I didn't know what I was going to do when I was in college. And sort of talking in class about ideas solidifies the ideas in your head, so I think it's a good thing. Yes?
I think the college degrees are more relevant to the real world now too, especially in some of the arts areas.
Could be, yeah.
Because I know when I wanted to be an illustrator, but when I went to take the art classes, it was all fine art. It was,
right.
It was, you know, in that period, it was
right.
nothing that looked like anything.
Well, I had Mr. Katz at Portland State for my advanced art teacher, and I spent a month doing my final painting, and what he chose to, very proud of it, and what he chose, and it was this big and about that wide, and what he chose, he always chooses one at the end of the year, and he chose a toilet seat with a pair of tennis shoes nailed to it. So I walked out, and he caught me in the hall walking out, and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I don't need to see that. It was already done back in New York when Duchamp demanded that the urinal be shown." I said, "So I don't need to see it again." And he said, "You need to see it because it's art." I said, "You can call the world square, but it doesn't change the fact that it's around. And you can call that art, don't make it art." And that's me. Other people have a different definition.
It's true.
Any more questions? Because we need to close this, I think. Anyone? One more.
This is kind of an odd thing, but I don't know if you noticed, but I was holding a little Hellboy figure that I had made.
Yes.
It's a toy line called Mini Mates.
Yes.
Is it possible for you to make work out with Art Asylum to make some more, to make some official Dark Horse Mini Mates? Because I'd really love to see them.
We're happy to do it. I mean, we just have to talk to the company, and they have to be interested. But David Scroggie.
Comic book characters like they
Yeah.
DC, Marvel. They especially a lot of Marvel. They're working with Image now, and so you need to get in there.
Oh, yeah. I'll just do it, right? Okay, well, I'll look into it, okay? But if we do it, you don't get any royalties for thinking of it. Okay, well, thank you. If you have any other questions, I'll stay around for a few minutes.